Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about special senses. In particular, we're going to be talking about different types of receptors. If you have not yet watched the divisions of the nervous system video and the action potential video, please go back and watch those first because the information we're going to cover today is directly related to those. So last time when we were discussing this, during the divisions of the nervous system, we wrote out this very complicated piece of paper here. But the upshot is that sensory neurons bring in information from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. And the brain and the spinal cord are part of the central nervous system. Those neurons or nerves are called afferent nerves because they're bringing in information from the outside to the inside, to the central nervous system. Integration would happen, and then some type of signal would go out on motor neurons to affect some type of change in the body. And last time when we talked about sensory neurons, we had two different types that we discussed. One had to do with picking up information and senses from body organs, and one had to do with picking up information and signals from your muscles, your joints, your skin, and your special senses. Now, special senses are your sight, your hearing, your taste, and your smells. Or smelling, not your actual smells, you smelling smells. And those are called somatic sensory nerves. And we're going to talk about those nerves today. So first of all, let's discuss the types of receptors. We have two main types, and all receptors fall into one of these two types. Exteroceptors detect stimuli from outside the body. Interoceptors makes sense that they would detect stimuli from inside the body. So all receptors, sensory receptors in your body are either going to be detecting stimuli from inside or outside your body, and we just break them into those two just so we know where things are coming from. Interoceptors tend to be involved in homeostasis, and exteroceptors are picking up anything that comes from outside the body. The outside air is cold, and you're going to pick that sense up on an exteroceptor. You're listening to my voice. It's coming from outside of your body. You're picking up the sound of my voice on an exteroceptor. So these tend to be your sensory information from the outside world. This tends to be sensory information from the inside world. And we actually have 4 types of receptors. Each of these types can either be exteroceptors or interoceptors. The first one are chemoreceptors. And they are stimulated by chemicals. When they bind chemicals, it's going to stimulate them and cause an action potential. The second type is a photoreceptor. And these are stimulated by light energy. This is the energy in a ray of light. Our third type are what we call mechanoreceptors. And these are stimulated by different mechanical forces. Things like bending or stretching or pulling or just squeezing, pressure. And our last type are thermoreceptors. And these are stimulated by temperature. So pretty much all the types of receptors fall into one of these main categories. So let's talk about chemoreceptors first. Chemoreceptors can bind to chemicals, and that binding causes an action potential. So let's quickly draw a neuron over here. So we have a neuron with its receptors at one end, and this is sensory. These are sensory neurons, so they have the cell body in the middle instead of the cell body at the end. And then you have your axon, and your axon terminal is down here. And remember, in a sensory neuron, this is going to be in the peripheral nervous system, picking up information. And this one is going to be in the central nervous system, and we're going to be bringing information to the interneuron. And remember, an interneuron is a neuron that is wholly within, completely within the central nervous system. So in the case of a chemoreceptor is going to bind to different types of chemicals. At some point, the amount of chemicals or the amount of binding is going to stimulate this neuron, and it's going to create an action potential. The action potential is going to run down the axon, and it's going to cause the release of a neurotransmitter at the axon terminal, which will then stimulate an interneuron. And the job of the interneuron, remember, is integration. And integration is simply the summing or adding up of all signals that it receives. Oops, signals is 1L. So depending on how many axon terminals are coming in to our interneuron, it's going to sum up all of that information that's coming in, and perhaps it will then send out some type of motor signal. Okay. Am I still in here? There we go. All right. So with chemicals, what's an example of a chemoreceptor? Well, chemoreceptors can pick up glucose levels. So glucose is the chemical that would be binding to these receptors. Now, if we're picking up glucose levels, we know that's an interoceptor, because we're not checking to see how much glucose is outside of our bodies. We're looking to see how much is inside. pH is another one that we're going to pick up, because remember, pH is really just a measurement of hydrogen ions in the body. And so as hydrogen ions go up or down, that change is brought to the central nervous system by chemoreceptors. Those are going to be interoceptors. Examples of exteroreceptors that are chemoreceptors would be your special senses of smell and taste. So for example, in the case of smell, if you are smelling something, what that means is whatever you're smelling, the chemicals that make up that substance have come into your nose, and those chemicals are binding to chemoreceptors in your nasal cavity. Chemical will cause the neuron to send an action potential to the central nervous system, where that smell will be picked up and integrated by the interneurons. Same thing for taste. One other type of chemoreceptor is called a nociceptor, and these pick up pain. I'm going to highlight this or circle this, put a box around it in red, because this is an important vocabulary word. A nociceptor is a pain receptor. Pain is picked up by the body because cells that are damaged release chemicals. Those chemicals bind to nociceptors, which is a type of chemical receptor, and the stimulation of those nociceptors tells the central nervous system that there is damage in the body, and we feel that as pain. Now, it's important to realize that even though all of these are chemoreceptors, receptors that pick up glucose levels are not going to be able to pick up the chemicals that are involved in detecting pain. And the chemicals that bind to the chemoreceptors in your nose and on your taste bud are not going to necessarily be able to pick up other types of chemicals. They're all very separate. Okay, so photoreceptor, this is kind of an easy one. This is involved in your special sense of sight. The light's coming in from the outside of the body and will stimulate that photoreceptor, and cause an action potential to be sent to the central nervous system. For mechanoreceptors, there's a bunch of different ones. These are actually stimulated by mechanical force. I forgot to write that word. Mechanoreceptors are activated by mechanical force. Force, that is something pressing on the neuron, and when the neuron is activated by pressure, it will send an action potential. So say your stomach is full, or you have to go to the bathroom and your bladder is full. Those are pressures that can be felt by a mechanoreceptor. Those are both interoceptors. You can also have a pressure receptor that is an exteroceptor. Say your hand is here and I push down on it. I can feel that pressure. I have mechanoreceptors in my skin that can pick up that pressure. Touch. Touch is kind of like pressure, but it's a lot lighter. So this is where you can feel something very, 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 very soft, barely brushing against the hairs on your arm. One of the special senses that uses mechanoreceptors is your sense of hearing. So again, this is something that is bending, and when it's bending, it sends an action potential. And another one that's really important is proprioception. Now, proprioception is the ability of your body to sense its position in space. So for example, if you were blindfolded and I lay you down on a table, you would know if the table was upright or perfectly flat or just a few degrees off of flat. We have equilibrium sensors that can help us determine if we're upright or flat or somewhere in between, and those are called proprioceptors. They also help us determine whether our arms are extended or flexed or what's going on. They pick up stretch in joints and muscles. So I'll put that here. And our last type of receptor, and I'm losing my voice, are thermoreceptors, and they're going to basically just pick up temperature. Temperature inside the body would be picked up by thermoreceptors that are interoceptors, and temperature outside the body on our skin would pick up the temperature of the outside air, and those would be exteroceptors. Okay, so I think that's it for the types of receptors. The next video is going to be about the eye, so come on back for that one.